Symposium, Fall Symposium 2. We have a guest panelist, guest speaker today. Sorry, I'm trying to minimize windows here so I can read her bio. Dominique Wilson. She is a clinical professional counselor intern in Nevada, a certified rehabilitation counselor and licensed associate counselor in Arizona. She works in Las Vegas providing mental health services for individuals experiencing complex trauma and disruptive impulse-related disorders. Dominique has experience working with high-risk populations. She was a crisis worker in Tucson, Arizona, assisting first responders by completing assessments and making placement recommendations for individuals who were suicidal, homicidal, or experiencing psychotic symptoms. Dominique also completed assessments for mental health court systems and made recommendations that influence court-mandated treatment. She has experience working with children, families in crisis, as well as being a former Child Protective Service investigator, where she assessed children's safety and assisted parents in meeting their court-mandated service plans. Dominique received her undergraduate degree in psychology from St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas. And as an undergraduate student, Dominique excelled and was chosen to teach psychology undergraduate courses. That's a big deal. When you're an undergrad and you're teaching undergrad, that's a big deal. Completed behavioral research at SeaWorld Antonio. I didn't know there was a SeaWorld Antonio and San Antonio with beluga whales, and published in academic journals. As a graduate student at the University of Arizona, Dominique continued research exploring the impact of school police officers and the perception of school safety while completing her master's degree in mental health counseling with an emphasis on disability students. Welcome, Dominique. Hi, folks.
Hey.
Thank you, Dominique, for being here tonight. I'm sure we'll have a very exciting discussion for everyone, and I hope everybody's excited as I am. So I asked Dominique to be a panelist at our symposium because she has extensive experience working with crisis intervention and had worked alongside a number of first responders. And I felt that this was something that all of us would probably run into if we stay working in the field in human services or any provider type, honestly. And I'll let her take it from here, Dominique.
Well, I guess I would really want to start with any questions that people have, or I can share some personal experiences too, Oscar. I don't know exactly how you want me to start.
Yeah, so we can just have a natural discussion here. So I'll just ask you things. How did you get into crisis work? What did that look like? And what was your educational experience and training to get into that?
So it's kind of funny. I was working at CPS at the time, and I was reaching the point in my master's in which I needed to really, really focus on my studies. And so I could no longer work full time. I really, really wanted to stay with CPS because I absolutely loved that job. But they couldn't keep me because I needed to go part-time. There was no part-time options. So what I ultimately decided is to give my resignation, and I had heard about a crisis team position. And I had no idea what that was at the time, but it was in my field. I had a bachelor's, so I qualified. So I applied. And when I interviewed, go ahead.
What does a crisis team look like?
So a crisis team has a master's level clinician and a behavioral health technician. The behavioral health technician is mainly there to make sure all the paperwork is done correctly, is the person who is in charge of safety, and that's kind of like, wait, what? But when a master's level clinician is providing a crisis assessment and de-escalation, they don't really always have the opportunities to make sure the environment around is safe. So the behavioral health, excuse me?
They might be distracted interviewing someone.
Yes, absolutely. They may be distracted. So the behavioral health tech is in charge of filling out paperwork and also making sure the surroundings are safe. Because oftentimes when you're out in the field in a crisis situation, you could be in a dark alley. I mean, you could be in a wash. You could be in the back of a store where there is no one else. You just never know where you're going to end up, or even in somebody's house. which can be dangerous, that has drug paraphernalia or weapons. So that was mainly why we have two-person teams, is one for safety and two for ease, just making the paperwork process, the assessment process go more smoothly. Such as a peer provider is the question. I'm not sure what that term is. It's not a peer. When people refer to like peer supports, we refer to somebody else who has experienced the situation in which you are helping the individual. So not really a peer, if that's what you mean by peer provider, to that individual who had the question. But this person has a certain amount of training. They've gone through some CPI training, they have CPR training, and have at least, I believe the criteria was 2 years experience de-escalation or some type of mental health care. We had a lot of BHTs that were, and that's behavioral health technician. We had a lot of BHTs from inpatient care. So they went from working inpatient, doing holds and takedowns and working with very high risk populations, who would move over to crisis work. And so to answer your question, it was mainly about safety, and we had a two-person team. So what ended up
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, when you mention any kind of acronyms or a vernacular from the field like holds and takedowns, I'm going to ask you to explain that, and just because some of the folks might not be familiar with it.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, somebody completed CPI training. It is awesome. It's not that helpful though when you're actually in crisis situations, just so you know. And I worked crisis for 2.5 years, to answer that previous question. So a hold is basically when somebody is acting out behaviorally, and they can either harm themselves or harm another person. So you have to do strategic holds, ways of getting the person in a safe position. So I really don't explain that without showing you, but if you would look up like mental health holds, CPI training teaches you as well how to do that. So for you who have CPI training, you would have learned to do some basic holds. So it basically holds the person in a way that they cannot harm themselves or others. If any of you guys have worked with children who have behavioral issues and they start attacking you, then you can basically put your arms, interlock their arms in your arms and put your hands like behind their head, is the best way I can describe it, and put your feet around their feet. Oh, perfect.
Yeah, so here's an example of a hold. When I worked at the hospital, we did this where you kind of, you want to hold, you don't want to harm the person, but you also don't want to let them harm you. So here's another example with a child, something you might do.
Yep.
And there's ways of approaching it. It's always best to do it in a team, but yeah. And this in of itself can be traumatic. If somebody's strong enough to hold you like this, I mean, that doesn't seem fun, but it's better than letting them hurt themselves or you.
Right, and holds are last resort. That is only if this person is at risk of harming themselves or others. Otherwise, you don't want to do it because, like Oscar said, it could be very traumatizing for somebody to be held. I mean, just imagine if one of you were in a crisis or were in a very intense emotional state and someone was holding you down and you couldn't move. That could be really traumatizing. CPI, I think it stands for crisis prevention intervention. Anybody taken the training recently, you can help me out with that, but I believe that's what it stands for. So I applied for the job and, well, I got it. And I will tell you about my first day. It was intense. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And I was training with these two individuals named Trent and Dave, who were the best trainers. I couldn't have been in better hands. These people could just, I mean, de-escalate anyone. It was so impressive. So I was very glad to be under them for training. My first day, I went out on a call for a professor who was, I think, late 30s. And she was having what she says is her first manic episode, which is atypical because you typically see first mania in late adolescence. So for her to have it in the late 30s was different. Um, and so she was talking to God. She was writing me letters telling and giving them to me, and it would said, God said to tell you that you're pretty, or just different things like that. She was in a happy manic phase. These were the more pleasant people to be around versus the angry manic phases.
So
Um,
mania, which can be a symptom of bipolar disorder, I'm just going to explain this, Dominic,
okay.
because they might not know, is if you want to imagine your mood swinging between happy and sad, you can go into what like is mania. So it's like you're really happy here, mania is like way up here, and it doesn't always have to look as a positive or excited. It can look as anger and things like that. But I'll just briefly talk about some of the symptoms. And to qualify for a manic episode, you have to meet criteria for 3 or more of the symptoms. Abnormally upbeat, jumpy or wired, increased activity, energy or agitation, exaggerated sense of well-being, like I am amazing, like I'm so amazing, I think I want to, apply for NASA to be captain of the next mission, like euphoric confidence, decreased need for sleep, unusual talkativeness or pressured speech, racing thoughts, distractibility, poor decision making, buying things, taking really risky behavior, and then making really foolish investments, or sometimes gambling. And this can be mimicked by substance abuse too. So we don't know if we're dealing with a psychological crisis or if this is induced through a substance related use. Thanks for indulging me, Dominique. Just I want to make sure everyone understands what we're talking about here.
Yeah, of course. And somebody just came in with a question. It was kind of long, so it just popped up, but you'll have to share
Yeah,
it with me
what tips
after.
would you give someone getting into the field when they have experienced a very traumatic situation? So I guess they're asking if that person has. In a sense, what do you do to maintain your level of drive without getting overwhelmed by the interactions?
Okay. I'll answer that one in a little bit because that one's really important.
Yeah.
So she was manic, and God was talking to her. We clearly identified that we needed to take her to the hospital. So we were going outside, and I was filling out paperwork because that was my first day, and so I was just trying to get acclimated to the paperwork, let alone somebody experiencing this. And I'm just like, wow, I've never seen this in real life. I learned about it in school,
Mhm.
but I was like, wow, like I was just kind of remembering like the videos that my professor showed me of what a manic episode looked like, but hadn't experienced it. So there I am filling out paperwork, and I'm outside, and she's next to me, and I look up and I'm like, where'd she go? And I turn around, she's behind me. She's completely naked
Oh,
out in just the middle of the road. I mean, she wasn't in the road, but she was standing right next to it, and cars were passing by. And I was just like, um, and I looked down at my paperwork, and I'm just like, where did Trent and Dave go? Because I didn't know what to do. I was like, wow. Um, so they eventually came out, and we got her back inside and got her clothes on. And then we had identified, okay, we can't take her. She's a flight risk. We didn't want her to open the car door while we were driving and jump out of the car, because she was starting to become angry and escalated at this point.
mhm.
So we had the family take her, and what we did is we followed them to the hospital to make sure that admission went smoothly. Um, yes, that's bipolar 1, not bipolar 2. Anyways, so that was my first day. And that is when I was like, okay, can I do this? um, well, I did it for 2.5 years, and I actually got very good at it. I was very surprised at how calm I was able to be in a crisis situation, probably only after about 3 months of working crisis. And the question is like, what interventions can you use to calm down an individual like this? And I think more importantly is keeping your calm when somebody is very escalated like this, or is experiencing a behavioral health crisis. We do a lot of mirroring. So mirror neurons are in your brain, and they are reading other individuals' reactions. And so when you keep your voice nice and calm and soothing, that person who's escalated will be more likely to match your calm state. So no matter what the situation is in a crisis, you want to keep your voice pretty neutral and calm and soft, to not escalate that person further. The other part of it is identifying exactly in the moment where the crisis is. So, is this because this individual just went through a breakup? Or is this because the person's dad just died? What is the triggering event? You want to identify that as soon as you can, so that you can work specifically with that to de escalate that portion of it. Oftentimes, a person out in crisis is psychotic, suicidal, or homicidal. With the homicidal ones, you kind of have to keep your distance, and what you have to be really strategic, and one of your partners has to be calling the police, because with the homicidal cases, we didn't have police accompany us every single time, because we would get a dispatch just like a police officer, where it would say, you know, Billie Jean, DOB, here's the situation. And that situation, that dispatch, sometimes would be completely different when we actually got on scene. So we may get a dispatch that's just like, oh, experiencing suicidal ideations, client feels lonely, may possibly need a BIP placement, which is a brief intervention placement, and I can describe that later. So we go there, right? And it could totally be the opposite and actually be like the person's actively using drugs right in front of us, and then there's a violent person in the house. It can just be completely different from what our dispatch said. So we always, always, always had to be on our toes in identifying and following that gut feeling. Are we safe? And I think that part is a lot of the reason why individuals get concerned with doing crisis work. A lot of clinicians, rather, get really maybe scared or just unsure and lack confidence in doing crisis work, because you do get in situations that put you at risk and can be very scary. Oscar, I saw a lot of questions come in, so.
Yeah. So the one was asking, your dispatch was notified from emergency call center.
Oh, no. So in Arizona, the way they have it set up is we would get dispatch from Simpatico, was a company that basically oversaw all mental health in Arizona. So they made sure mental health programs were compliant. And then Simpatico was a large funding source. So basically they would fund all the programs and make sure they were compliant. But what they also had was a crisis hotline. So what people would do in the community who were in crisis, they would call Simpatico, and Simpatico would send a dispatch to our phones. And whenever we got a dispatch, then we would get in our CBI cars, which is a company I work for, with our team, and then we would take off to the crisis call, whatever it was.
Dominique, what's the benefit of having these kinds of teams opposed to just having emergency first responders like police, fire, paramedics show up?
Well, with police, a lot of people through either direct trauma or vicarious trauma have been traumatized by the police. So when they come in contact with a first responder, like a police officer, they can become very agitated, which increases likelihood of individuals being shot by the police, or just the situation becoming way more than it needs to be. With EMTs and fire and police, all three, it can be rather costly for taxpayers. So having a crisis team come out saves a lot of money, because not only are we less expensive, but we also can take people to the hospitals and run an assessment and be able to use our clinical judgment on where this person should go that's least restrictive. So it saves the individual the trauma of having to interact with first responders. And, we're therapists, so we're like pretty warm and nurturing. So we're not as scary as, somebody with a bulletproof vest and a gun, or all the officers were very, very nice. But when they were working with mental health individuals in crisis, they could sometimes be maybe a little ignorant and just not be able to use the right words to interact with individuals in a mental health crisis. So
Right,
it
they're not really
escalates.
trained for that, and so and they're better suited to saving people's lives and protecting people with weapons if necessary. And first responders such as fire, EMT, paramedics, they have life-saving skills that could be better used than de-escalating a crisis situation, which is a crisis, but it is not a medical emergency.
Exactly, and it's just
And
not in their purview. They don't. I mean, they receive basic training, but not to the extent that someone would who have gone through a master's program and has a postmaster's experience, where crisis comes up a lot in your education.
right, so when you're trained from the lens of a first responder, let's say police, for example, you're looking at somebody who's either engaging in what's considered criminal behavior or not, right? And so
Hmm.
your choices are more limited in terms of what you're going to do. But when we're trained in a different way to recognize mental health crisis, and it can look like abhorrent criminal behavior or just very bizarre, you can realize, oh, this person is in crisis. They're not necessarily on drugs. They might be too, but
Well,
they're
if they're on drugs, like the way I see it in a crisis, as a crisis clinician, if they're on drugs, so what? They have a disease, they need help, and so we shouldn't criminalize that. If they're out there selling and they have it on them, okay, I can see how that's a little bit different. But if they're actively intoxicated and they're experiencing a crisis, I'm as a crisis clinician, I'm more in the stance of, okay, let's get them to safety. Let's get them somewhere where they can medically detox and be safe. I'm not thinking about, okay, this person needs to be in jail because they just used heroin.
right. That's a secondary for our concern.
Right. And like you were saying, the training perspective for police officers is more, it works on a duality. So is it criminal or is it not? Whereas clinicians, we're more trained in the gray areas, right? Where we try to look at the whole person and determine, okay, so what does this person need? How do we keep them safe, not only from themselves, but how do we keep society safe as well? Which is a way that you can make partnership with first responders. Look, we're here, do the same goal is to keep society safe and to keep the person safe. So a lot of times when working with police officers, you can definitely create a partnership and just bringing up the fact that you're there with the same goal is to keep society and that individual safe.
Right. And I'm sure they are grateful, especially as they get used to seeing you folks, because they might recognize there's something there, but they don't really have a lot of options. If they take them to police officers, typically have the privilege to the legal privilege of placing people on a legal hold, and they could take them to a hospital, right? But how much time and energy does that take away from this police officer who could be on the beat, patrolling, responding to criminal justice concerns that are more appropriate from them, rather than handing this off to a crisis team that has resources available. They know the referral services. They know which hospital might be available. Maybe they don't need to go to a hospital. Maybe they just need to go to a BIT, like you mentioned, which is a kind of a cool down area, and have a much better outcome and cost the taxpayers a lot less money.
Absolutely. And I think the importance to really hone in on is that it saves the individual from any more unnecessary trauma. They're already in crisis.
Right.
Let's not make that worse. So having the crisis team go and people who are trained to de-escalate and trained to be nurturers and to be solution focused, so that that person at the end of it feels safer and feels like they were glad that they called the crisis team, or that they're glad a family member called the crisis team on them, or they're glad the police called the crisis team, because sometimes the police wouldn't know what to do.
Right.
They would be like, well, we can't take this person to jail because they didn't commit a crime, but we're not comfortable with leaving this person here. What do we do? They would call us,
Right.
and we would do the assessment, and we would tell the police officers, this is where this person needs to go, and they would listen to us.
So we have a couple of questions here that I'd like to ask. Does it also in a way, help with not criminalizing mental illness. For example, you get to them instead of police so they can get to a hospital instead of a jail for assault of an officer, for instance. Yeah, if they're not compliant, and they don't do what the officer says, they're going to be in big trouble. It doesn't matter if they have a mental illness, because now things have gotten to another level and they have their protocol. So I'll let you answer that before I do.
Okay. Yeah, when it comes to like laying your hands on a police officer or doing something that is clearly unlawful, you know, the mental health issue, your crisis really can't save you from going to jail. I think maybe a few times we were able to convince the officer not to, but you know, the officers have their protocol, and the officers are not trained to understand the difference between disorderly conduct and disordered conduct. Disorderly conduct is more of a legal term, where there is a law being broken, whereas disordered conduct is symptoms of a mental health diagnosis that are appearing right now that could look unlawful. However, it's part of that person's mental health disability. And so therefore they are covered under ADA and should be protected. So just because they are having disordered behavior, they should not be criminalized for that.
So there's a question about, Nathan's asking a very big question, which I don't know if we can answer. I'm familiar with suicidal prevention acts, which kind of mental illnesses are there and how are they classified? There are, I don't know, hundreds probably of mental health disorders. I would say maybe you could respond to the ones that are most common that you would respond to in a crisis scenario.
A lot of the ones that I responded to were schizophrenia, the mood disorders, so major depressive disorder, bipolar 1, bipolar 2, some conduct disorder, domestic violence, severe drug use. I mean, we responded to somebody who had just died of an overdose. We have responded to individuals who still had the needle in their arm when we walked up to them.
Mm-hmm.
So substance abuse, definitely. Schizoaffective, I think those are delusional disorders. Those are the primary ones that we would respond to. And adjustment disorder too, like something just really big has happened and they're having some symptoms because of it.
So Dominique mentioned a lot of mental disorders that you might not be familiar with. So just as a reminder, these folks are associate level students. And delusional disorders is when you have a belief that is not in reality. So if she, like, let's say Dominique believes that aliens are following her, or the government has tapped her phone, or there's somebody living in her walls, that would be an example of a delusional disorder. A hallucination is when you see or experience sensations that are not from the outside. They're what we call internal stimuli. You might feel like bugs are crawling on you, like coke bugs. That people often report when they use this overdo stimulants, they'll feel these.
Can I share a little bit of stories from these?
Please.
Okay, so I know I saw more questions, but I do want to share a little bit of story. I think this just makes it more interesting when you have the story to back it up. So you said the bugs, right? So there is a Mengelin's disorder, and it's basically the belief. It's a medical disorder. It's not in the DSM. It's a disorder where it's a delusional parasitosis is what a mental health person would call it. You are seeing bugs underneath your skin that aren't really there. I went to a lady who had this, and she was picking her skin with whatever tools she could find. And she had this binder full of dust particles and dirt and just stuff that she swept up in her house. And she was pointing to it, and she was like, "Those are bugs. Don't you see them? Those are bugs." And she practically had these like laminated sheets with all of these. I was like, wow, you spent a lot of time and effort to laminate all this dirt, basically. I didn't say that. You do not ever say that to somebody who's delusional, by the way.
You don't question or challenge their delusions.
Yeah, you do not question or challenge the delusions. You just go with it. Um, and so we ended up taking her to the hospital because I think she hadn't eaten for a few days and she just was disheveled, which basically means she's not taking care of her ADLs, activities of daily living. Sorry. Um, and she was just not going to be okay if we left her there. So we took her to the hospital. But that was the story of the Mangellan's person. But the other one, the delusional disorder individual that I had who had delusional disorder, she had these pamphlets from one of these hospitals in Tucson. And she was like, my dad, he owns all the hospitals and he's just left me in this horrible, horrible squalor of an apartment. The apartment was very tiny, very dirty. Um, and she, again, was disheveled. Um, and she shows me these pamphlets and she's like, look, and he even puts me on the front cover of all his pamphlets. And so she's showing me the pamphlet, and she's an African American lady. And the person in the front of this pamphlet is as white as can be. And she's like, how dare he use my picture without my permission? I'm so angry with him. And again, I was still relatively new during this one, so I was like, I don't even know how to respond to this. But again, you don't question the individual's delusion, but that's just one of those stories to show you like this stuff happens.
Yeah,
And
how really out there some of these experiences are. And, Dominique and I both went to clinical mental health master's programs, and we read about it and we watch videos about it, and we see, but it's not the same thing. Yeah, when I worked in the hospital, I was like, oh, this is what they mean. Yeah, this is the first time I'm seeing a actively schizophrenic with negative symptoms. The people that stand like trees for days on end. Or these active delusions and hallucinations, and how disorienting it is to be around somebody like that if you haven't experienced it before. You're like, what do I do?
right. And somebody's question came in, what do you do with the delusions? You really can't do much with them. There's not a lot of treatment modalities that are useful with them. The best thing to do with them is give them have them go to a psychiatrist for a medication evaluation and have them start getting on some psychotropic medications. And psychotropic medications are the medications that we use for mental disorders.
Um, yeah, so it's not, you're not going to be treating in these situations. You're just
Hmm.
trying to de-escalate, get them to relative safety, ensure that they're able to care for themselves, or put them in a situation with providers that can care for them. And this is the thing. So most of the time when we put someone on a psychiatric hold, they are a danger to themselves, through suicide, or to someone else through a homicide, or they're unable to keep themselves safe. Like they might just walk into traffic if they're not perceiving reality from kind of a shared perspective, or they might put themselves in very dangerous situations. That's another. While they're not, they don't fall into harm to self or others. They cannot care for themselves.
Hmm. And that would lead more into the court-ordered treatment, which is what I also did in Tucson. Is when somebody is gravely disabled, which means basically if no intervention is done, they could possibly die, or they are at risk for suicide or harming others. You can submit an application. In Tucson, they called it a Title 36 application, which basically is a legal document that would start the process for court mandated mental health treatment. And so what I would do is I would go out to these individuals where these applications were put in and do a mental health assessment. And then I would have to write up a mental health court report. Those were interesting. And then the judge would read it and make his determination if the person was going to be mandated for mental health treatment. I saw a question for the difference between schizoaffective and schizophrenia. Um, Schizoaffective has the mood piece. There's which has bipolar type or depressive type. Whereas schizophrenia, you have more of like the disorganized thoughts, and you have hallucinations, positive and negative symptoms, which basically means positive symptoms. you're seeing or hearing things that are not real. The negative symptoms refer to affect, so that is the face and the expression. When you're having a negative symptom, the face is going to be really just flat, no expression. The voice is going to be really monotoned, and so that's the difference. I hope that helped.
They're closely related, and the way we make a differentiation between the diagnosis is if they're more closely aligned with one set of symptoms than another, and they don't meet criteria for the other one, you'll give them a different diagnosis. But those ones are kind of sloppy diagnoses. Sometimes they can get a schizoaffective or schizophrenia disorder, when if you take a longer history or see them over time, you'll recognize one or the other. But treatment probably looks very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody was asking, what is the what kind of salary you get for a crisis worker?
What salary?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in Tucson, I was only making like $22. But Tucson also has a much lower cost of living. So I would imagine if you were doing a crisis job here in Las Vegas, that would probably double.
So yeah, I'm looking at, no, I don't see it on the occupational.
Ooh, somebody's in Tucson. I could totally get you a job in crisis if you wanted it.
All right. Everyone's calling me right now. Sorry.
That's okay. You guys might hear my crying baby out there.
Corey was asking if he had worked with children in the past, and maybe what's crisis work looks like.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, as a crisis worker, you don't discriminate by age. I mean, we had plenty of children that we were called out to, and a lot of those situations were suicidal ideation, surprisingly, especially between the ages of, I think, 10 and 14. Just a high incidence of suicidal ideation,
Were a lot of those kids
which for me was very surprising. No.
No.
A lot of them, this was their first interaction with a mental health provider.
Another question, do you come across retired military with PTSD? What's the best way to handle those situations? We each deal with it differently. Some of these questions are so big, we could talk for 4 hours about this, but.
So I know that's like an entire class discussion, not even just 4 hours. But in crisis, yeah, I can answer that. In crisis, yes, there was a lot of individuals with PTSD, especially the veteran populations, and they were the most likely to be homeless or to be, oh gosh, I remember one man. This was the first case that just really tore me up. I went to do a Title 36 assessment, and that's that court mandated assessment I was talking about earlier on this gentleman. He was a veteran. And he was like, I want to die. I just can't take this anymore. And, I listened to his story, and this person, he did not want help. He had the date circled on his calendar. He felt like he was a burden to society, and he was just like, I just really can't do it anymore. There's nothing you can say that's going to change my mind. And this individual, like, he wasn't homeless. He had a nice, quaint apartment, and his daughter came to visit. And I'm not saying like, oh, his life was good, so he shouldn't be suicidal, but it's just not typical of what you see when these individuals get so low. And he had the date set. He's like, I asked him if he had a weapon, and he said no, but I knew he was not being truthful. Just based on his body language. And I just knew that there was nothing I could do. I could write up the facts in my court report, but I knew that it wasn't going to pass. He wasn't going to end up getting court mandated treatment just because of the way he answered. Like, I intuitively and in my gut as a clinician knew that he needed help and needed to be hospitalized and put into court mandated treatment. But I don't even think the court mandated treatment would have saved him. I I don't know what happened with him, and I don't want to know, but I think it's likely that he killed himself on that day.
Mhm. Yeah,
So that, go ahead, Oscar.
veterans are very likely to complete a suicide because they have trainings with weapons and they usually have weapons. So those folks, they're not. This is not a cry for help. They're going to complete suicide. So a lot of
Hmm.
times you've got to hospitalize them, get them into a hospital setting, or sometimes they've got be placed on a psychiatric hold till they report they don't plan on completing a suicide. But that doesn't ensure anything.
Right, and that was the problem, is this individual had already been put on a hold, and he already got out. He was like, "Look, I mean, you could put me in the hospital, but it's not going to change my mind." And the holds, they only keep you for so long. But this
Right.
this man had just he made up his decision. He'd made his decision, and there was nothing anyone was going to do or say to change it.
Hmm.
And me and the other clinician that I was with, like, she was crying like uncontrollably over this, and like I felt really sensitive about it, but I mean, I didn't cry, I think only because she was crying, and I felt like I needed to be there for her. It really, she was a PhD level, and I was there barely. I was still in my master's program. Just the amount of, and I think this just goes to show how taxing this work can be too, because you are really on the fine line of life and death as a crisis worker. You really are. I had one individual who died, starved to death. It was an anorexic client before I could get to her.
Wow.
So her family wouldn't let me see her. I kept trying to go and visit because the crisis team kept being called by the neighbor because they were just concerned when they would see this lady. She basically looked like she didn't exist. She was so skinny. Um, and we would go, and the people who she lived with wouldn't let us see her. And I don't know. I just had a bad feeling about that when I felt like they were enabling her not to eat. And they were probably, you know, just not helping her.
Right. So, what's an option for that if that situation arises, just in hindsight?
Um, I mean, we called the police and made a report, but they said there's nothing they could do either.
Mhm.
I'm sharing these examples. These are the examples where there is nothing you can do. These were only two examples in my entire work as a crisis worker. So I just want to let you guys know that if you want to do crisis, you will come across these situations, but they're not going to be a
So,
whole lot of them. Yeah, this was two, and these are probably the only two I had where I felt completely helpless as a crisis worker. Um,
yeah.
all the others were we did our work. We saved lives.
Yeah. So, there's a question here. Are there any techniques or skills that rural EMS could be taught to assist with crisis individuals on the street level?
Can you repeat that question?
Are there any skills that rural EMS, because a lot of these folks live out in
Okay.
rural Nevada, could be taught to assist with crisis individuals, on the street level, so to say, when they,
And you said with
uh,
EMT?
EMS, yeah, EMT.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I was just making sure I understood which population we're talking about. Yes. So one of the main things I would say is your your body, being aware of how you're standing with an individual in crisis and going down to their level like you would with children.
Are you threat?
So when somebody's in crisis, you do not want to be within 5 feet of them. I would say 10 feet, 15 feet is probably safest. And if they are laying down or sitting down, you want to get down probably to where you can still get up really quickly, but just down to their level. And keep your voice as calm, as collective, and collected as you can, so that they see that you're calm in a situation of crisis. They're going to start to mirror that.
Mhm.
Another thing is to just be with them and not don't talk to them in a way that's demanding. Don't demand anything when you're first meeting with them. So if you're EMT, there's things that you have to do, right? You have to check their heart rate, and you have to do different medical things that you guys do. But don't go into it and just say, all right, hand me your hand. All right, let's do this. Okay, I need you to do this. um, actually just ask the person, like, is there anything I can do right now in this moment to make this situation better for you? And chances are, like, the person they will say no, but they'll already feel a sense of comfort with you. Some of them may be like, screw you. I mean, the drunk people tend to do that or will curse at you. But still, you at least gave it the opportunity. So I would say connecting with them on a human level before you're just throwing demands like, hey, I need this, I need that from you.
So yeah, one of my experiences, and I respond to crisis interventions. I have a contract open with Crisis Care in Southern Nevada, and so they'll call me if there's a thing like the big shooting that happened last year. And one of the things that I try to do is as Dominique said, that we respond to social cues. So if she raises her voice, the other person's going to get excited, right? If she's talking fast, they're going to talk fast. So slowing down your speech is going to slow down their speech. Watching your nonverbals, your breathing. If you slow your breathing down, and this has been proven in research studies, the other person will slow down their breathing. So don't let them pull you into their state of anxiety, of the rapid breathing, the high blinking. Pay attention to how am I feeling internally right now. Center yourself. Slow. This is something that professional sports athletes do. They're in this situation. There's 20,000 people in the crowd, and they have to perform, but they don't panic and they don't lose focus. So you really keeping your internal. How am I feeling right? Am I frightened? We're animals and we sense those kinds of things. Fear and aggression and things like that. When a dog's about to jump on you. So disarming yourself, so you're better able to interact with this person. They feel comfortable and safe. That's really important.
While keeping yourself safe,
right.
though.
Yeah.
So being disarmed but armed as well, and not armed in the sense that you have a weapon, but like, the situation I'm describing where you're kneeling down, but you're still in a stance where you can easily pop up and run if you need to. There's a lot that goes into meeting somebody when they're not expecting you versus meeting them when they know a crisis team has been called. Does that make sense? Like, if there was a lot of times where we were called to people who had no idea that we were called, so when they would see us, they'd be like, why are you here? Who called you? And automatically get defensive. So you would have to be a little more, as a person like that is not, if you're telling them to do deep breathing, they're gonna be like, no, why the hell are you here?
Right.
But for those people who, like Oscar, your situations, it sounds like you're called and these people kind of already know
Yeah, they know.
that you're coming, right? So they're more open to intervention, which the interventions that Oscar mentioned are fantastic, especially for people who are overwhelmed and are anxious. But when you're coming up on somebody who's just like, why are you here? Who called you? They don't know what your intentions are. They're like, are you sending me to the psych hospital? Are you part of the police? They don't know who you are. So you have to respond differently to every situation because you don't know if they know that you've been called or if they're under the influence of substances. Or what the situation is. You don't know if that they were just beat up by their domestically violent partner. You don't know if that partner's still in the house and you just met this person outside and that person's going to come out. You just don't know. Crisis work sounds really scary, guys, I know, but it really wasn't that bad.
Would you mind talking about your experience when you were pregnant?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so I did crisis work throughout my entire pregnancy, all the way up until what? The week before I delivered. So when I was around psychotic people, and even people who were like anxious or even the people who were suicidal, but primarily the people who were psychotic, just being around a pregnant woman calmed them down so much. They would see me coming towards them, and as soon as I would start talking to them, they would just look at my belly and would start asking questions, and you could just see their state of arousal just steadily decline. And all of a sudden, we were like joking about, I don't know, something that happened, just random stuff, and the person would be completely calm. And then I'd be like, well, I'm a little bit worried about you. And I think since I look like a maternal figure, the that kind of just flowed through me and out to the person. And I was just like, I'm really worried about you, and I just want what's best for you. And so I want you to come with me, and I'm going to take you to the hospital. And so people who weren't voluntary at the beginning, I could convince to easily come with me. Yeah, mom voice. um, and so I don't know, that it was just amazing, because I noticed a vast difference between when I wasn't pregnant and I was working with people who were psychotic or even aggressive. It even helped with aggressive people. They calmed down. I don't know. I think that there's some type of primitive instinct to not be a certain way around somebody who's pregnant, and that would explain it. But that was definitely interesting to see. Also, if you guys don't believe in this, that's okay, but I proved it every time there was a full moon. Full moons, oh my God, I will tell you, full moons are the worst. So on a general day in crisis work, without a full moon, we'd get about 4 to 5 calls a day. On a full moon, we would get like 10 to 11 to 12 calls a day. It would double. It was intense. Everybody was just in crisis on a full moon. So I don't know. I know that the moon has to do with like the tides and all that. I don't know anything further than that because I don't study the moon, but there is definitely at least a correlation.
There is a positive correlation, and I can attest to that too. And when I worked acute psychiatric at the hospital, and we knew we would look. I mean, I would plan my days off around the full moon because
Yes.
it would get nuts. And Brene said psychosomatic. No, it's real. There's a reason, in Spanish or in Latin, luna is the moon, and lunatic is related to that. That
I never thought about that.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of reasons people react to the moon, and it's part of lore, myth, legend, and falling in love too. But there's a lot of things that make you go kind of crazy, and that's one of them. I don't know why either. I don't have a scientific explanation, but we have a statistical correlation that is true.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we would just get right. We would look and we're like, you know what? We'd remind each other at the full. We're like, oh God, we're gonna be in for it. And so. But one of the great things about working in these kinds of situations, it's the bonds that you create with the workers. I'm sure your team, you never forgot them, Dominique. I had the same experience with the folks that I work with at the hospital. We became so close because you're dealing with really difficult situations, and you're there supporting each other. I know.
Right. You become a family. That's how we were in our crisis. Like we worked with different people every time, depending on the shift that we picked up. But we were like a family. We would have 10-hour shifts, and some days we'd only get one call, So we spent that entire day with our partner. So we get really, really close, talk about each other's families, what's going well, what's not going well. Just like police, when they have their partners, like you get really close to your partner, and you're protective of your partner too. And so, but some days it would be hell, and we would kind of get irritated with each other, just like family too. Like, oh my God, we've had 10 calls. We haven't had a break. We haven't even been able to eat because we've had call after call after call. It's intense.
Yeah, Lisa mentioned that she's had crazy days at work with this full moon, and
oh yeah, there's a full moon right now, or yesterday. I don't know. We're
I know
hitting
there's
a
a
full
lot
moon.
of questions. I hope we got to most of them. Somebody asked about if we're aware of any kind of crisis services in Pahrump. I popped in a couple links there that you can take a look at, but you can kind of search in your own area. What kind of education you have to go through to become a crisis clinician? Would you be able to find a job in this educational background in social work? I'm working towards my bachelor's in social work, and was wondering if having this would be beneficial to become a crisis clinician or a job.
I dropped you guys. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, you can answer.
I was trying to click on the question box. So I can speak for Tucson. You can do crisis work at a bachelor's level.
Mm-hmm.
You'll just be a part of a team that has a master's level clinician. However, in different states, you more than likely need a master's level. So other states that I've looked into, they have still 2-person teams, but both of them are master's level. And so what I mean by master's level, it could be in psychology, it can be in social work, it could be in counseling. What am I missing? I'd imagine marriage and family therapy, but I know that they are not as trained in crisis work as some of the other helping professions.
Most of these folks are gonna, you could work in a kind of what they call a paraprofessional position, but you're gonna have to have a master's level clinician. One, because this person is capable of, has the legal authority and scope of practice to put somebody on a psychiatric hold. So you can sign what in Nevada is called an LTK, and this is where you say that this person needs to be put on a 72-hour hold, evaluated at a psychiatric facility, and then assessed by a psychiatrist. And so you're taking away somebody's rights. It's not prison, but it feels like it because you can't leave until they say you're okay to leave. This isn't like going to the doctor in the hospital and you're like, I'm leaving AMA. You're not leaving. You can't get out. The 72-hour hold is not federal unless you're in federal land. They might have to do something different.
Yeah, it's at each state level. And also, just because it says 72 hours does not mean the person will be there in 72 hours, will be there 72 hours. It basically means that the psychiatrist has up to 72 hours to provide an assessment and to make a recommendation on care. So if the psychiatrist meets with them in 12 hours and is like, person's good to go, they could be out in 12 hours.
Okay, there's a couple more questions. Now, yeah, they could be out. They could not be accepted. Maybe they calm down by the time they get to the hospital and they're like, we're not going to take them. I worked at a hospital, so sometimes they'll take them with what's called a soft admissions, which is they probably don't meet criteria, but just to be safe, they keep them anyway. And then it takes days to get out, or a week, or a month. And that can depend, because these folks have to go before a judge and 2 state psychiatrists, and that's usually in Nevada. It's through like a closed circuit TV, and if they don't present well, they're not going to go anywhere. They're going to stay there until they can stabilize them.
Yeah, I had one individual who was swallowing nails, like actual nails that you put into the wall. She was swallowing those.
Yeah, you're gonna die.
She ended up staying there for like a month.
So
they eventually did ECT treatment on her. That's how bad it was.
Yeah.
Electroconvulsive therapy.
Yeah, ECT is not as bad as you might think. It's inducing a
seizure
through electrical impulses, but it's a lot more
humane nowadays.
Yeah, they have like, they don't have like the big giant machine they put on your head. They have like
you're not convulsing.
And you might, they'll put you under, they'll sedate you so you don't break something. And they have these teeny little pads, and they put them here, and they have a protocol that kind of goes through for depression or for certain things. And I've seen it work. And I was like, this is not. And I asked the psychiatrist when I was there, I said, can I watch you do the procedure? And he's like, yeah. So I just sat in the room. And interesting story was that this patient was really agitated with me. I had tried to kind of calm her down, and she got really aggressive with me. She said she wanted to file a complaint, and then we asked her if she wanted to change therapists, and we had the hospital administrator there, and I had my colleague there, and she's like, no, I'll stay with him. And she was making my life hell. And she did the ECT, and she forgot everything because it kind of erases short-term memory.
You forget you were her therapist?
Though she remembered me kind of, but she said, I feel like I owe you an apology for some reason. I said, that's okay. And I was like, wow, she did not remember the last couple dates. So it's interesting. So there's a question.
It is effective. It is effective.
It can be, yeah. It's kind of a last resort because there is some brain damage, minimal, but the level it takes for a hold for law enforcement is much higher. That's where the degree makes it much easier. I wouldn't know for sure. There's one L2K form, a Legal 2000, that everyone.
Are they saying different degrees make it easier for L2K?
Level it takes for a hold for law enforcement is higher. That's where the degree makes it. I'm not exactly sure. I don't know if they mean degree is in terms of an academic degree, or they mean.
Oh no! I think that they mean like maybe the police officer has to have a certain level of risk, or in order for them to make the legal 2000, versus a clinician may have a
Yeah.
lower level of risk
So,
to make
and
the.
I've called emergency services for a client that was either suicidal or unable to care for themselves, and they like to have you fill it out. They don't want to do it if they don't have to. Paramedics, I'll say I'm this. This is my patient, and I want to place them on an L2K because of this, and I'll usually have filled out
Right.
the form before they get there, and I'll coach my clients that are more potentially at risk for that kind of intervention. Like if they're severely depressed and they have active suicidality, I'll say, this is what could happen, because I don't want that to be a surprise to them, because we need to keep them alive, and that's what the hospital can do.
Mhm.
There's a big question here. I don't know if we can answer that. How many corrupt officials have you seen in the field? That I don't know. You know what? Corruption exists everywhere, and I've seen it in hospitals. I've seen it in law enforcement. I've seen it in
In
government.
our own profession.
I've seen it in our own profession. So
Yeah. I guess I can answer that loosely.
yeah,
So I wouldn't say corruption, but I would say some bad apples when I worked crisis work, mainly with police officers. And I don't want to get on this bandwagon of talking bad about police. Most of them are fantastic at what they do, especially in Tucson, because they work with so much crisis and they see us all the time. They're fantastic. It was more of the rural areas, because we would also go out to the rural areas of Tucson, like all the way out to the Indian reservation. So I worked a lot with the Tohono O'odham tribe, and just really far away, and where there's just desert. And I'm like, wow, people live out here. But anyways, so we would have police officers from those areas who maybe just didn't have as much experience with crisis work. And I had one particular incident where I was out seeing an individual, and I don't even remember the individual. I just remember that police officer, because he was such not a nice person. But anyways, we were called to assist him in a possible L2K. And so when I got there, he goes, I don't even know how to deal with this person. And he was just very rude. And said something like, this person's cuckoo, and just making some really derogatory, demeaning terms and statements about this person. So already I was like, I didn't tell him anything. In my mind, I was like, wow, I do not want to talk to you anymore. So I left and I went to go talk to the individual, and the person, I was able to de-escalate them in less than 5 minutes. Like if that officer would have just like met them where they were at and just talked to them like a normal human being instead of treating them like they were crazy, it wouldn't have been an issue. And we ended up community stabilizing that one, meaning we didn't have to take them anywhere. So we were able to, the person was able to contract for safety, basically promising that they wouldn't harm themselves or others. And then we had a safety plan that we put in where the person, it was an elderly person, that their daughter would come over. And I called the daughter and I asked her, hey, can you come over around this time just to check on your mom? And that was our plan.
right.
So yeah, that officer, and there were multiple situations like that. Normally from the newer people on the force, because I would say like we worked with the same few officers all the time, because we had like the most crisis calls in certain areas of Tucson. So those officers would be assigned to those areas, so we'd work with them mostly.
Yeah. So just thinking about poverty is a factor in major mental disorder. So in areas where there's higher prevalence of poverty, you're going to have higher incidence of crisis, right? That makes sense. Um,
So that person who just talked about Tucson again, Tucson has MIST teams, MIST. Forget exactly what they're called, but they're a clinician and officer teams. So I got to work on these too. Is that your partner is not a BHT, your partner is a police officer, and you basically ride around in a squad car with them, going only to crisis mental health calls.
yeah. So the police, in not just in Tucson, but in Las Vegas, I know they have their own crisis teams. I actually know one of the clinicians that works on there. She's actually an MFT, and has extensive training working with. She's actually gone to the FBI crisis, training and things like that. So, but what is happening is municipalities and local governments and county governments and state governments are recognizing that if we don't address this for what it is, we end up with lawsuits for abusing people who are mentally ill or suffering some kind of psychological distress, reacting in ways that are not appropriate for these kinds of situations. And then it's costing us so much more money, we can't ignore it anymore. So they're developing teams, specializations, and folks like you guys, I'm sure a lot of this stuff is familiar to your coursework if you're in the Human Services program. If you're in the ethics class, maybe not so much, but we talk about a lot of these kinds of things, and the more you are informed, the better likelihood you are of getting jobs in this area. But even if that isn't your main job, like I have a private practice, and I will see clients I've never seen before. Somebody will schedule an appointment, and I see clients after hours, and I see somebody 7 o'clock at night, and they somehow make an appointment with me, but they're completely psychotic by the time they somehow they got to my office, and I'm like, I've got a crisis right here in my little office, which you don't expect, but it can happen. I've had folks who decompensate. They suffer another setback, a traumatic setback, or they lose their job or something like that, and they're ready to complete a suicide. So it can happen from all different levels of care, and that's why it's good that we're all exposed to this. And I want to thank Dominique for her time and sharing her experience and knowledge and expertise with us tonight. It's been an exciting
We do
discussion.
need to, somebody just brought up that we need to talk about trauma stored in the body. So I don't know how much time we have left or if we're done.
We can go till 7 o'clock, but I want to honor your time. I
Okay.
said you could give us an
Okay.
hour.
So yeah, we could talk about that real quick, because I did want to touch on it. So me and Oscar, before many of you signed on, we were kind of just chit-chatting, and the conversation of trauma being held in the body came up. I forgot how this came up, Oscar, but I was talking about how it's important that every profession know about mental health, because at any point in time you may come across somebody who's having a mental health crisis, or just some issues related to mental health. I was telling him about one of my I knew a chiropractor who was saying that he was doing some work on somebody's body, and the person began to cry uncontrollably. And so what had happened is, he had tapped into this individual's trauma. And so, the Chinese have a lot of practices where they believe that trauma is held in different body parts. Oh, there you go. And Reiki practitioners as well. Like one thing for me is I had a very traumatic childbirth experience when I gave birth to my child, and I went to a Chinese acupuncturist, and she pointed out that I had trauma in my hip, which is the hip that's been abnormally tight and been causing me a lot of issues. Um, and through working through my trauma, with that experience in my own therapy, I've noticed that I have had significantly less stress and tension in that hip. Well, when you're working on somebody's body, if you're a massage therapist, a chiropractor, I mean, even if you're just taking somebody's vitals and you touch them in a way that reminds them of a trauma,
Right.
you are activating a traumatic response, which can cause them to react in a crisis. So it's important to know how to respond when you do that, and important to ask permission to when you are touching somebody, because you do not
Yes.
know what trauma people hold. I had one client who, anytime anybody touched her in the back of her neck, she had flashbacks to when she was sexually assaulted in the shower. Um, so she would react in ways that people were like, "Oh my God, why are you reacting that way?" But it's because she had a lot of tension in the muscles behind her neck because she carried a lot of trauma there. When anybody was behind her and she could feel their presence, her neck would tense up and she would have flashbacks. I had one client who is a Pilates instructor, and she was so traumatized. She came to me, she's like, I need to work on this today. She was working with an individual doing Pilates, and she was showing this person the stretches. and showing this individual how to do the Pilates movements correctly. Well, this individual started crying, got up, ran to the bathroom, shut the door, and then came out, grabbed her shoes, and ran out of the building.
Wow.
And my client was like, I caused harm. I did something wrong. I must be a terrible
Activated a blood
person.
response.
Right, right. And so what this person did is by teaching this person how to do Pilates and, specific touch and, helping her with the movements activated trauma in that person. And she didn't know how to respond to it. She said, I knew something was wrong, but I froze. I didn't know what to do. All I could do was ask, are you okay? And then that caused this individual to shut down even further.
Right. So
And
one
then
of the things that, and we study this in our master's program in neurobiology, is that the brain has friends, little mini brains that are throughout the body, the heart, the gut, the pelvic area. And those little mini brains are called ganglia. They're like a collection of nerve cluster, and they act as like a smaller processor. And sometimes, without any memory or lack of access to that memory, that trauma is stored within the body. And I pulled up this book by Bessel van der Kolk. It's a great book if you're interested in it. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. It talks about how this kind of trauma that's locked inside the body can make people physically ill, and the different ways and methods that you can access it and then resolve it. That can be through talk therapy, EMDR, which I know Dominique is trained, various types of therapeutic interventions we have available to us. So I just wanted to mention that before we run out of time. Go ahead.
this book is fantastic. You may have to read it twice because it has a lot of jargon in it, but I highly recommend it as well. It is fantastic.
Yeah, I've heard yoga instructors tell me the same thing. I mean, I personally, I'm a little bit claustrophobic. I don't know why. Like, I might just open the door when I'm in an office somewhere. And I was doing child's pose with this person, this yoga instructor was teaching me, and she kind of like pushed on my back. And I don't know if you guys know what child's pose is, but you're kind of facing down, and to me, it's supposed to be a relaxing, grounding, and I'm like, I'm panicking right now. And I even said, I don't really feel comfortable. And she pushed on my back to get me to go lower. And I'm like, I want to stand up and punch this lady right now. I don't know why. I was
Oh my
so
gosh.
just irritated, and I know it had something to do with something. I didn't know what. But if we're not what's called trauma informed as providers, we can make mistakes like this, like forcing somebody to talk about something. An example of something you might do in a therapeutic setting is you might say, what's coming up for you? Why don't you take a deep breath and just scan your body from head to toe? Tell me where you might feel that tension. And it's in my stomach. It's like it feels wet and tight and cold. And they might have descriptors, they might not. And upon further discovery and exploration of that through therapy, they'll come up with memories that have been suppressed or repressed, and that can help resolve that. And PTSD has a lot to do with these kinds of things. That's why we have specific interventions for them.
Yeah, PTSD, I would say the best treatments for PTSD are EMDR, somatic experiencing, and parts of memory work. You guys will probably have to look up those terms. I'm like,
Yeah,
it would take me forever to describe exactly
right.
all what goes into that.
What we want to impart is that there are specific interventions and trainings that you can take in order to work with these kinds of folks, where previously a lot of the treatments, like even 15 years ago, were not very effective. People would drop out of treatment. And so
And they have specific trainings that are typically meant for mental health individuals, people in the helping professions that are open to first responders and law enforcement. I see that all the time. So don't think that you're not welcome in those spaces. Mental health providers aren't going to be like, oh my God, why are you here? We welcome and we want more providers to be informed, because we're a community and we're all in this together to help the individuals who really they can't help themselves. So taking those horses when they do come up. And sorry guys, I'm like on my bed and I'm like, I wish I could be in my study, but I'm moving right now, so everything's boxed up. So I'm like
No, that's
trying not to be
okay.
unprofessional here, but
Thank you so much, Dominique, for being our special guest. And we really are honored, privileged to have you, and I'm sure everyone appreciates that. I want to let Dominique go now because we agreed to an hour, and I want to respect her time. She's in the middle of moving and has a very busy life. So, and I'm sure she wants to be with her family right now at 6:55 p.m.
yeah, I'm kind of hungry, want a little bit of dinner, but this was fantastic. Thank you all guys for hearing my story.